There is no house to return to at the end of the day. No clay oven built into a wall. No shelf worn smooth by years of the same hands reaching for the same jar. No lane between neighbors. No shared well. No roof to sleep on when the summer heat becomes too much. For some people in ancient Egypt, home was not a place, it was a direction that changed with the season, with the flood, with the pasture, with the needs of the animals that kept them alive. We think of ancient Egypt as a civilization of permanence, of stone monuments built to last 10,000 years, of villages rooted so deep in the Nile silt that the same family farmed the same land for generation after generation. But at the edges of all that permanence, there were people who moved, who had always moved, who understood the desert not as an obstacle, but as a territory, vast, demanding, and alive to those who knew how to read it. This is their story. Egypt had two worlds. The Egyptians themselves named them clearly. Kemet, the Black Land, the dark, fertile strip along the Nile, narrow in some places, wider in others, but always defined by water, by flood, by growth. And Deshret, the Red Land, everything else, the desert that began where the last field ended, pale, hot, immense, and in the Egyptian imagination, the domain of Set, the god of chaos, of storms, of the untamed. Most Egyptians feared Deshret. They lived their entire lives within sight of the Nile, never crossing into the Red. But others lived in that space between, in the wadis, the dry riverbeds that cut through the desert hills and ran briefly with water after rare rains, in the oases where underground water pushed up through the stone and made islands of green in the middle of nothing, on the desert margins where the last grass of the floodplain met the first sand of the open desert. These were the Shasu. The Egyptians wrote about them extensively, not always kindly. In official texts, the Shasu appear as raiders, as threats, as people who refuse the order that Egypt represented. They are shown in tomb paintings and temple reliefs being driven back, captured, defeated. But those texts were written by the powerful about people who had no scribes of their own. What archaeology and careful reading of the evidence suggest is something more complex and more human. The Shasu were semi-nomadic pastoralists. They moved seasonally through the Sinai, the Negev, the eastern desert margins, and the territories beyond Egypt's eastern border. They kept sheep and goats. They traded with Egyptian settlements. They sometimes worked within Egypt's borders as laborers, soldiers, and herders. And they had been moving through those landscapes for longer than Egypt had been building pyramids. The camp appears in the early morning. Not from nowhere. Those who know the desert can read a campsite like a page. The fire ash, still slightly warm. The pressed earth where animals rested. The small, cleared circle where tent poles were driven in. The faint smell of goat and smoke and cured hide. They were here last night. They are already gone. A Shasu family on the move is not a family in crisis. It is a family doing exactly what its knowledge demands. The father, perhaps 40 years old, lean and sun-darkened beyond what even the Egyptian farmers showed, his skin the deep reddish brown of someone who has spent every hour of his life outdoors, walks ahead of the group, reading the ground. He is looking for signs that another group has passed recently, for the state of the vegetation on the wadi edge, for the direction of the wind and what it carries. Behind him, the family. His wife manages the animals, a small flock of sheep and goats, 12 to 15 animals, each one known by name in the way that farmers know their fields. She carries a young child on her back, wrapped against her in a length of woven wool cloth. 2 older children walk beside the goats, keeping the flock moving, preventing straying. On the backs of 2 donkeys, not camels, not yet. The camel was not yet the desert animal of Egypt in this period. The family's world is packed and loaded. Rolled tent panels of woven black goat hair, tent poles of stripped acacia wood, clay vessels wrapped in cloth to prevent breaking, dried food for days when no game is found and no settlement is near enough to trade, a skin of water, always water, carried with the same care a farmer carries a newborn lamb. The family does not own land, but they know land in a way that no farmer ever could. They know where the wadi holds water 2 weeks after rain and for how long. They know which rocky outcrop gives shade at midday in summer. They know the desert route between here and the next pasture well enough to walk it in darkness if they had to. And sometimes they had to. The day of a nomadic family does not begin with a fixed place. It begins with a decision. Before the camp stirs, the father is already up. In the desert, the transition between night and dawn is not a gradual lightening, it is a shift, from the hard cold of the desert night to the first warmth of a sun that will, within hours, become something to hide from. He studies the sky. He checks the animals, the goats, nervous if something passed in the night. He reads the ash of last night's fire and the state of the pasture around the camp, and he decides, stay one more day or move. When the family moves, the camp disappears in less than an hour. The tent panels, large sections of woven black goat hair cloth, the same material the Bedouin have used for thousands of years, come down in a practiced sequence. The poles are pulled, stacked, tied, the animals loaded, the firestones left. And the family walks. Not aimlessly. The Shasu knew their territory the way a scribe knows his papyrus, every route, every resource, every risk. The ancient Egyptian word for their territory, preserved in military and administrative texts, was Ta-Shasu, the land of the Shasu, a region that encompassed much of the southern Levant and the Sinai Peninsula. They moved through that land along routes that had been walked by their parents and their parents' parents, stretching back past memory. The midday halt is not chosen randomly. It is a known place, a rocky overhang, a cluster of acacia trees, a wadi wall that throws shade at the right hour. The animals rest first, always the animals first. A family with healthy animals survives. A family without them does not. The children drink from the water skin, sitting in the strip of shade, their feet bare on the hot stone. The mother prepares food. There is no oven, there is no shelf of stored flour, but there is fire, always fire, made in minutes from a wooden drill on a nest of dried grass, and there is grain carried in a cloth pouch, ground roughly on a flat stone, mixed with water from the skin, and cooked as flatbread on a heated rock. It blisters and chars at the edges. It is eaten quickly while it is warm.
Copper, hides, and resin. What do you offer? Grain, 2 sacks for the copper. and the hides and resin. Agreed.
The Shasu were not isolated. This is perhaps the most important thing that Egyptian records unintentionally reveal about the people they described as outside civilization. The Shasu appeared regularly at Egypt's borders. In the eastern delta, administrative papyri from the Ramesside period, roughly the same era as our story, 1300 to 1100 BCE, record Shasu groups being admitted through the border fortifications to water their animals in the pools of the delta marshes. One document records the border official writing to his superior that Shasu tribes from Edom had requested passage, that they were seeking pasture, and that permission was granted. This was not unusual. It happened regularly enough to be routine. The Shasu traded copper from the Sinai mines, worked by Egyptian prisoners but transported by people who knew the desert routes, resin and aromatic gum from trees in the eastern hills, animal hides, dried meat, goat hair for weaving, information, the routes, the conditions, the water sources that Egyptian military expeditions depended on to survive. In return, grain, linen, bronze tools, pottery, things that a nomadic family could not easily make but absolutely needed. These exchanges did not happen in formal markets. They happened at the edge of settlements, at the desert gates of walled towns, in the seasonal camps that formed wherever two worlds briefly touched. A Shasu family arriving at the edge of an Egyptian village was not always an event. Sometimes it was simply Tuesday. The children of both groups, briefly in the same space, would have looked at each other with curiosity. The Egyptian child rooted in her village, the Shasu child who had slept in 3 different places this week, each one unable to fully imagine the other's life. The Shasu carried their gods with them. This was not unusual for nomadic peoples, gods who lived in portable objects, in wooden poles and sacred stones, in the act of naming and remembering, rather than in buildings that required foundations. Egyptian records mention, in passing but with unmistakable specificity, a place name in Shasu territory, the land of the Shasu of Yahweh. This reference, appearing in Egyptian topographical lists from the reigns of Amenhotep III and Ramesses II, roughly 1400 to 1200 BCE, is one of the oldest known written mentions of a deity by that name. What it means precisely, scholars continued to debate. But what it tells us is this: the Shasu had a religious life with specific names, specific territories, specific devotions, a life rich enough and distinct enough to appear in Egyptian administrative texts as a known quantity. Their beliefs, like their camps, left few physical traces: no temples, no painted tomb walls, no libraries of papyrus. But they were there. A tent pole driven into the earth of a wadi camp, a fire built at dusk, a name spoken under a sky full of desert stars, in a landscape where the absence of walls made the sky feel enormous, close enough to touch. The gap between how Egypt recorded the Shasu and how the Shasu likely lived is worth sitting with. In temple reliefs, the Shasu are shown being trampled. Pharaohs seize them by the hair. They are listed as captives in tribute registers. In official texts, they are chaotic, dangerous, other. And yet, the same texts that describe military campaigns against the Shasu also record them being hired as scouts, being given passage through Egypt's borders, being settled, in some cases, within Egypt itself, working as herdsmen, as soldiers, as laborers, A papyrus from the reign of Merneptah, son of Ramesses II, records the rations distributed to a group of Shasu workers hired to drag stone at a construction site. The same people depicted as enemies in the temple walls were being paid in bread and beer one corridor away. This contradiction is not a mystery. It is simply how the world has always worked. Official narratives describe threats. Ordinary life negotiates with neighbors. The Shasu were real people, navigating a real relationship with a powerful neighboring civilization, trading when trade was possible, retreating when pressure came, surviving by knowing their landscape better than any army sent to control it. They were never conquered completely. They were absorbed sometimes, dispersed sometimes. But the desert routes they walked had been walked before them and would be walked after them by people with the same essential knowledge that the land outside the floodplain was not empty. It was simply home to those who knew how to live there. The camp is gone by the time the sun clears the eastern ridge. The firestones are left behind. They always are. Too heavy to carry, too useful to the next person who needs them. The pressed earth where the animals rested overnight will hold their shape for days until the wind covers it. A child's sandal, worn through at the heel, left behind, too damaged to keep, too small to matter. These are the traces, not monuments, not inscriptions, small marks in the sand that the desert erases on its own schedule. For the Shasu family, the day ahead is the same as the day behind it. Another wadi to follow, another calculation of water and pasture and distance, another camp, made and unmade, in a landscape that asked everything of them and gave back exactly enough to survive. They did not build temples. They did not leave libraries. They did not record themselves. But they were real. They walked real ground. They carried real water in real skins under a real sun that asked no questions about civilization and made no exceptions for anyone. The desert is very old, and the people who learned to live in it were older than the cities that tried to name them. They were simply living the way they always had, the way for a very long time they always would. If this quiet journey into the past resonates with you, you're welcome to subscribe and be part of this project. It's the best way to support these reconstructions and keep them alive here on YouTube.